everybody, and welcome to episode 82 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Gavin, and our usual other two co-hosts are actually out this week. Mike is still adventuring, and Fia is doing her field work. So normally it would be just me talking into a microphone like this. But today we have a pair of my friends from grad school who are now doing cool things that I'll introduce here in a little bit. But before I get into that, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping stuff. Just general... I want to plug our social media. I feel like I don't do that enough, and since I'm pre-recording this little intro, I figured I'd do it now. Social media is really the best way to interact with the podcast and share your ideas, share your thoughts, and even share it to friends. We're really trying to grow the podcast, and so if you could share it with even like one or two of your friends who are science curious, that would really help out a lot. Or you can fill out any of the couple of forms that we always have down in the show notes to suggest episode ideas or potential episode guests or topics. That would all help us out immensely. Secondly, with all the things going on in the world, particularly here in America, I thought I'd plug a way that I've actually been doing some things, and apparently Mike has done this in the past, because I reached out to them, Mike and Fia, to see if they'd be cool with me, talking about this, because it's their show too. But I started recently doing this thing called Tab for a Cause. It's a Google Chrome extension. And it basically, every time you open a new tab, it displays a couple of ads, and the money from that goes to charities that you get to choose. So I personally have mine set to go toward reproductive rights, since that's a thing we need to be worried about here in America for some reason. But you can change it to any number of things, such as helping fight water scarcity in different countries, helping fight, like the war in Ukraine, climate change, any kind of, nonprofit. They have quite a few options, like 20 or so different options of things for your ad revenue to go to. So there'll be a link for that down below. And if you use our link, we'll get some extra hearts that we can donate. That's what they're called, is hearts that you donate to various causes. So we'll get some bonuses for that. And I think you will as well, to donate to whoever you feel like you should donate money to. On top of that, we also have another adventuring update from our wonderful co-host, Mike.
Hey everybody, Mike here. Just giving you guys a quick update on the peaks I'm doing. For those of you that aren't aware, I'm trying to do the 46 high peaks during the course of this summer up in the Adirondack Mountains. Pace has slowed down a little bit for a variety of reasons, weather related, my knees related as well as a couple other things that I have to take care of back home. I'm currently up to 16 peaks. Just yesterday I was able to do Phelps, Tabletop, and Colden Mountain, and that walk back from Colden, it took quite a while, and my knees are rough. So between that and the fact that it's raining today, there's not going to be any more mountains coming up in the next couple of days, but I'm hoping by this time next week I'll have some new updates for you guys. All the best, and take care, everyone.
All right, but let's talk about our guest. First, we have Carolyn Kocken, who is currently a paleontology assistant at Badlands National Park in South Dakota. But in August, she'll be joining the University of Kansas at Lawrence Museum of Natural History as their museum education coordinator, which is, museum jobs are really hard to come by. So that's really, really impressive. And our other guest is Rudolph Hummel, who is a paleontology assistant at Waco Mammoth National Monument down in Waco, Texas. So I'm super excited that we got to hang out again. It's been a while since I've talked to either of them, but it was a really cool way for us to all nerd out about paleontology. This episode does get a little technical because I don't have Mike or Fia to sort of rein all of us in on the paleontology nonsense. So this episode might get a little technical, but I had a lot of fun recording it, and hopefully you'll have a lot of fun listening to it. All right, so Carolyn and Rudy, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We're super happy to have you guys
us.
on. Yeah, it's been a while, and it's actually really funny. We actually just a couple days ago did a paleontology themed D&D one shot DM'd by Rudy, which was a whole lot of fun. So it's good to be talking to friends again, because we haven't really talked since I left all that much.
Yeah. It's good to
everybody got super busy with school, and someone got married in there,
Yeah, I sure did. Speaking of that, big shouts to Carolyn, because I think I had mentioned around, when the wedding happened, that there were some shenanigans going on Yosemite's end, and their special events coordinator, for one reason or another, was no longer able to take like emails or calls or anything. And the person who took over that role did not have access to their email account. So we were basically just sending emails into the void, and we did not have our permit to use the park to get married. And so with like 3 days before the wedding, I put something in our grad school group chat and was like, hey, does anybody know anybody that works at Yosemite? Just because, in paleontology, working in the park service is, fairly common, as you guys can attest.
Oh, yeah.
And so Carolyn was like, I don't know anybody, but I am in a Facebook group of people who could, and probably within like an hour, I think, right?
Yeah, about an hour. I got a DM from somebody that said, I am literally standing in the permitting office with the person who now has this position. What's the name of the permit?
Yeah.
It was ridiculous.
Yep. And so basically right then we got our permit in, Liz's email, and we were able to get married. So Carolyn more or less saved our wedding. So
it was no big deal.
Right, but obviously, 3 days before our wedding, and we don't know if we're allowed to be in the venue. It was
big deal to Gavin.
Yeah,
sure
I'm just happy that it all worked out and that you guys weren't panicking over it right before, like the day of the wedding, going, "Oh no!"
Well, and it's so funny because we ended up getting there really early for pictures anyway, and there was nobody even at the front gate. So, our parents needed to show the paperwork to be able to get in because they didn't get there early enough. But long story short, Carolyn saved our wedding, and she's awesome. So with that, let's actually properly introduce both of you. So tell us a little bit about yourselves. Carolyn, why don't you go first?
All right. Well, my name is Carolyn Kocken. I'm originally from Minnesota. I did my undergrad in earth sciences with a focus in paleontology, and I minored in something called geographic information systems at Montana State University. Graduated there in 2019, took a gap year. COVID happened. I was working at Fossil Butte National Monument in southwestern Wyoming, and I luckily got into the master's program at South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. Went there for 2 years, graduated, and I'm currently working at Badlands National Park for my third summer now. And I actually just recently got a job at the University of Kansas Lawrence's Museum of Natural History. And so I'm going to be starting there in August.
Nice. Museum jobs are few and far between, so that's a big land.
Yeah, I'm very excited and happy to go down there and start that.
Absolutely. So, Rudy, go ahead.
Well, here's the thing. Carolyn and I have this bizarrely parallel career trajectory.
Yeah.
So I promise I'm not just copying her introduction verbatim, but also I am. It's just we didn't plan it that way. So I've lived in a bunch of places, but I went to high school in Minnesota, and then I went to undergrad at Montana State University with Carolyn. We were in the same class. We both majored in earth sciences with a paleontology focus. And then at the end of our degree, we both took a class on the natural history of Cuba and went to Cuba together.
That was fun.
And
that's awesome.
We both took a gap year, the same gap year. And then we both got into South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. We hadn't even told each other that we had applied. None of this was planned.
I didn't know that. That's awesome. That's really funny.
Yeah. We found out literally on a video or a phone call with a group of people, and we both were talking about future plans, and we both happened to say that we had both gotten in and accepted.
And actually,
at Mines.
That friend group that we were on the phone call with was our friends from Cuba. Was the Cuba group.
That's who it was.
Yep. So, and during that gap year, Carolyn worked for a national monument. I worked for a state park. And then since then, we've both done a bunch of national park monument internships and jobs. And then now we're both, I have 1 semester left of my master's at Mines. But we're now both on I Wish You Were Dead together. So we just keep doing this.
I can't seem to get rid of him.
And so that was a good unintentional segue into why you're both on here together. So a class that I took in the spring of my first year, so this was before Rudy and Carolyn got to Mines, there's a class that's offered every other year called Terrestrial Paleoecology. And so taught by Darren, who has been on the podcast before. And basically at the end of the class, you have to...
which is something that this show needs more of.
Yeah. No, that's okay. I'm now lukewarm of camels. I don't hate them as much as I used to, but
good.
Anyway. Rudy was one of the people that I vented to while working on my thesis about camels.
It's true. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. No, that's okay. So for this class, you, Darren, had us give a talk. And so I actually did my talk about Pleistocene rewilding, which we talked about, I think, way back in like episode 8 or something. And so for that same class, Rudy and Carolyn picked somewhat similar topics, or vaguely similar, same realm. So
yeah, that wasn't exactly an accident. Both of us were kind of having a hard time coming up with ideas for the paper topic because we had about a week to come up with an idea at the very beginning of the class when we'd hardly learned anything at all about terrestrial paleoecology from the class. And so we were both talking about ideas, and I think one of us brought up talking about Foster's rule, or essentially island dwarfism and island gigantism. And we thought, wouldn't it be neat if one of us took each of those different topics and essentially kind of did 2 separate reports on those similar but different subjects and kind of talked about how they're different from each other.
Nice. So I guess since you brought it up, what is Foster's rule?
Yeah, so it is also called the island rule. It's basically where if you have an animal that somehow, or a plant even, that somehow ends up on an island that's isolated away from the mainland, one of 3 things can happen. There can be pretty much no change with that living organism, or sometimes it can grow bigger or smaller, depending upon the different ecological pressures that are put on it. Things like how many resources are available on that island and what the predation is like on that island. And essentially it's kind of big things get smaller and small things get larger.
And this is all on an evolutionary time scale. So generations and generations.
Yeah, it's not immediate. It's not you suddenly have an animal go there and then its child is like half the size of the parent.
So the island rule states that happens, that if you put a small taxon on an island, it will get bigger with successive generations. And if you put a large animal on an island, it will get smaller. And that is, turns out, the subject of much dogma in this subfield. Because there are very clear examples where an animal has made it, or a species has made it to an island and then become larger or smaller. But it is not clear if that always happens. And that has been, Carolyn and I sort of accidentally tackled different sides of this topic, even outside dwarfism versus gigantism. And one of the things that I tackled a lot of is like, how do we test for the island rule? How do we know if it's even happening in a given case, especially in the fossil record? And then also, is the island rule actually a rule, or is it maybe more of an island phenomenon that we can observe happening once or twice, but isn't across the board?
Right. So we've sort of talked about in passing, at least the island dwarfism side. We had an episode about proboscideans, elephants and their relatives, and that sure is something that elephants like to do.
Yes.
Especially these days with elephants being the largest terrestrial animals. If it's beneficial to not be big, then they will very quickly become not big. So yeah, we have all sorts of, really cool examples of, size changing on islands today. And in my opinion, some even cooler ones in the fossil record. So what other kinds of examples besides, things like proboscideans, where it's pretty easy to see why, if you're on an island and you're so big, why it would be beneficial to become smaller. So what are some other maybe less obvious examples, at least from around today?
Um, Well, you'd be surprised at how many of them, especially in the fossil record, are not obvious. And that was another thing I kind of focused on is like, I think the island rule or island dwarfism in particular, it gets invoked a lot more than it should. So I have a bunch of examples that are actually pretty sketchy. I don't know if those are really what you're going for here. I can talk a bit about dwarf proboscideans if you want. And then Carolyn probably has a gigantism example.
I have a few gigantism examples. Yeah.
Go for it. Let's hear some more about proboscideans. Everybody loves elephants.
Okay, so proboscideans are a great starting point because it's obvious that island dwarfism is actually happening. And before I go further, I want to say there was a 2004 paper that suggested that rather than gigantism and dwarfism, we should be using the terms giantism and nanism, because dwarfism is something that is often used to refer to an individual of a species that's particularly small, not a species that is smaller than other related species. So right. I will probably go back and the thing is that paper didn't catch on. To my knowledge, no one else has used those terms ever since, but I like their reasoning for that. So I'll also use the term nanoid or nanism when I'm talking about dwarf critters.
Okay.
So for nanoid proboscideans, it's very clear that what's happening is actually island nanism. And I'll go over some reasons for why. First of all, as you probably talked about in your proboscidean episode, they did this a lot. We have nanoid proboscideans, nanoid elephants or mammoths from California, from Sardinia, Sicily, the Aegean Islands, Cyprus, Java, even some material from Japan, Wrangel Island. There's a bunch of them. It happened a lot. And in order to establish that something is following the island rule, or is a dwarf nanoid in this example, there's one thing that you have to clearly establish first, and that's that the ancestral state of this group was large-bodied. So there's two ways you can get what looks like island nanism. One of them, let's say you've got, I'm going to use Caribbean sloths as an example, which I'll come back to later. Let's say you've got a big sloth in South America, and it emigrates to the Caribbean.
And by this, I just to clarify for listeners, I'm assuming you mean ground sloths?
Yes, ground sloths. Yes.
Okay.
Good clarification. So let's say you've got a big ground sloth in South America. It emigrates to the Caribbean, and then on the islands, it becomes smaller because of island ecology. That is island nanism. But let's say you have a small ground sloth on the South American mainland, and then that emigrates to the islands in the Caribbean, and then the mainland one gets big. That's not island nanism, because the one on the mainland got big. The ancestral condition was small. They were originally small, and on the islands, they just stayed small. So this is where I think it's really hairy. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Yeah, and that topic especially gets difficult when you consider the fossil record, because a lot of times the fossil record has a lot of gaps in it. And so when you're looking at an animal in a taxa in the fossil record, you have to make that definitive. Yes, we have we A, know what its ancestor on the mainland was, and B, we actually have fossils of that ancestor. And so a lot of things that are oftentimes called island are called cases of island nanism or island gigantism. They're essentially saying, oh, we have this sloth that was on this island that was rather large. However, if they don't have that ancestor on the mainland to compare it to, you really can't say if it's a case of this or not, if Foster's rule is in effect. But oftentimes people will just kind of assume, sloths probably weren't this large when they came to the island, therefore it must be a case of this, even though we don't have the fossils to sometimes back it up.
Right. One of the reasons that the island rule is so contentious, so dogmatic in the literature is because there's kind of disagreement on how to test for it. Is it enough to call it island nanism if you have a small one on an island and a big one on the mainland? I don't think it is. And there are several authors that have also, stated that. But that gets into one of the reasons that dwarf proboscideans are such a good example for something that clearly is island nanism, because these guys were around recently enough that we have, first of all of our modern elephants are really big, and all of our fossil elephants from the mainland are really big. We know that the ancestral state of elephants was being big. And that when they went to islands, they became smaller. And we also know that because we've used DNA studies and things like that to actually, attach, for example, Mediterranean dwarf elephants have been tied to a specific taxon from Europe, I believe. It's a specific species of Paleoloxodon, I think. So each of these nanoid elephants or mammoths has been tied to a mainland taxon that was ancestral to it that was bigger. So we know that nanism is occurring with these. And also there have been studies that have kind of suggested that once an island is far enough out from the mainland, then you start to get nanism in elephants. And that nanism is enhanced if there are no deer or other medium-sized competitors for food. So they'll get even smaller if there's nothing else on the island. And then also the bigger the island, the less nanoid they become. If it's a small island, they get even smaller.
Yeah. And there's several other factors like that too. So space and isolation, like with what Rudy was talking about. Additionally, ecological factors such as water availability, temperature, how warm the temperature is, because that also plays into another rule, which is called Bergman's Law, which is where essentially if you're up in a cooler climate, you tend to see animals with larger body sizes so that they can better survive the winters, and then vice versa in warmer climates and towards the equator more. Another thing that is also beneficial, mainly in gigantism, is this thing called starvation resistance, where if an animal is on an island and it has a smaller body plan, larger animals have the ability to have more fat stores. And so they can survive time periods where resources are not as available, say on an island where there's not a lot of resources to begin with. And so that's kind of the reason, in part, why smaller animals tend to get larger, is so that they're more resistant to those times when there are less resources. Vice versa, with larger animals, there's less resources to begin with, so they can't sustain that large size and they get smaller.
Yeah, so I'm guessing Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, Carolyn, if any of your gigantism examples had that starvation resistance kind of.
That's for one of the. This is a fossil taxa. It's a gigantic bunny from the island of. Let me hope I can pronounce this correctly. I believe it's called Mallorca. Mycera. It's in Spain, and it's a relatively small island, and the rabbits that originally went there were the typical size of your normal rabbit, but this animal is 10 times the size of its mainland ancestor, weighing in at about 12 kilograms.
Wow, that's a big rabbit.
One of the kind of the it's a very big rabbit, but it also didn't really look like our modern day rabbits either. It was the largest herbivore on that island, and there were no predators. Okay. And so, as you were talking about earlier with the starvation resistance, it got bigger so that it could better survive times of drought, because this was a very dry, rocky island, and still is. And there's a number of morphologic or physical changes that the species underwent in its evolution. For example, it couldn't hop like your typical rabbit. It kind of ambled about like a beaver on land, essentially.
Oh,
is the best way that I could put it. Yeah, and it had a very hunched spine, and it had very shortened ears, and it actually had, they've analyzed its brain cavity, and they've determined that it had less developed senses of smell, hearing, and sight. Which, if you're on an animal that has no predators, you don't need those senses to look out for predators anymore, and you can use that metabolic energy to grow bigger. And so, unfortunately, these guys went extinct about, in the Pleistocene, during the first set of glaciations in that area, probably due to a bunch of cave goat, shrew, giant dwarf mounts that all arrived on that island at about that time.
Interesting. And we will circle back to things on islands going extinct, particularly recently. We'll circle back to that toward the end of the episode.
We got a bit off topic.
No, that's okay. But it's interesting thinking of just all the selection pressures going on islands, because, obviously there's always an incalculable number of selection pressures going on pretty much any species at any given time. But on islands, I feel like some of them are at least a little more straightforward, or at least you can sort of pin them down a little easier. And
I think what happens...
Go ahead.
I think what happens on islands is that some selection pressures get removed. So it's easier to see what selection pressures may be affecting something because there's not as much background noise of other pressures that you often have on the mainland. That's an oversimplification, but that's a little bit of what's going on.
Yeah.
Well, a really good example.
Is mostly true. Yeah, you go. You go, Gavin.
So I think a good example of that is all the countless examples of island flightless birds.
Yes.
Because if you can, flying is very energy intensive, particularly the way birds do it. And so if they can afford to not do that, they will not do that. And so that selection pressure of being able to fly to, escape predators or reach your food, goes away. And so all the other selective pressures that might have been also affecting become amplified more or less.
Yeah, and we do see that a lot. Like we see that with kiwis, we see that with giant moas from New Zealand. However, that's not always the case, even with animals that become gigantic. One example of this is the Haas eagle from New Zealand. They actually had a kind of unique selection pressure happening because they're a predatory bird. So a lot of the birds that you imagine for grow when they get bigger, they lose their wings. However, the Haas eagle originally was preying on moa, and so as moa got bigger, these eagles got bigger as well in order to continue hunting that prey. And
just for frame of reference, for anybody who's not familiar with moa, they are the largest birds ever, to our knowledge. Like 1,000-pound, maybe not quite that big, but in that range, birds. And easily a few hundred pounds.
They were from New Zealand.
Yes.
Yeah. And they've gone extinct. If I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah.
Yes. And so that's definitely, an interesting scenario where it's like, well, the island gigantism, is causing the ancestors of what would become the moa to become bigger. So the handful of predators on the island, mostly the Haas eagle, was like, well, my prey's getting bigger, so now I need to get bigger to be able to continue eating the prey, or I won't be able to eat the prey anymore, and I'll die.
And on the flip side of that, you sometimes get carnivorous birds that arrive on an island where there are no big land-dwelling carnivores. So in Cuba, for example, I think during the Miocene or sometime in the later Cenozoic, we have two different lineages of owls that lost their ability to fly and got really long legs and became these like fast-running meter-tall owl carnivores that were running down prey on Cuba because there weren't any big predators there and owls arrived and that niche was unfilled. So over time, that's what they ended up specializing in.
Yeah, island carnivores, I think, is a really interesting sort of concept relative to herbivores, because herbivores, it's more straightforward, I think, in that, well, this island only has so much area to be able to grow plants. So my population can only get so large, like physical size wise, in order to not eat all the food. And then that, obviously has to affect the predators. Like a really cool example of, because you typically think with that, like with the owls or the Haas eagle, where they get bigger because the prey is getting bigger. However, there's a particular population of reticulated pythons over in Indonesia that are also dwarfs. Reticulated pythons are the largest, at least longest snakes on the planet. They can get close to 20 feet, over 20 feet in some cases, but the dwarfs are like 5 max. And so
that's about right.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting, and I haven't really looked too much more into dwarf reticulated pythons other than I know a handful of people who have them as pets. But yeah, just islands are, like I said, some ways simple, but also real complicated. Because it's impossible to know everything going on in an environment to affect all. You want me
to throw some wrenches in it and start talking about some older stuff?
Oh, of course. Now we're dipping into the fossils.
All right, yeah. So I'm going to get into one of my stickier examples here. What do you do, Gavin, if you have an area that has been like, okay, so with nanoid proboscideans, we know that those were islands because they're still islands. And we know that the sea levels were different, but we can calculate that they were still islands at the time. What do you do with something from the Cretaceous or like the Jurassic? How do you even tell if that was an island?
I'd assume you'd have to look at the rocks around what you are proposing to be this island and say, well, okay, from here to here across the island, we have terrestrial sediments or, beach sediments. And then all around it, we see nothing but, shallow marine or deeper marine sediments.
That progression from land to sea.
Right.
And that's, geology 101.
Right. If you're lucky, you'll see that. But of course, if there's varying depositional environments and some of these environments aren't being deposited, or if they were...
Or things got eroded away and they're just not there.
Then you might lose some of this information. So in Romania, there's a deposit called Hotzig Island. And it's been inferred that it's an island, basically the way you just described. We know sea levels were higher at the time, and the sedimentology seems to support the idea that it was an island, or at the very least a very large peninsula. But it's pretty fuzzy because there's a lot of information that's not there. That was a long time ago. That was, I believe, it's okay. So it's Cretaceous. We're talking more than 65 million years ago.
And I think it was, decently like middle Cretaceous. So probably around 100. I think you're right. Yeah.
So that was a case where, all the tectonic reconstructions and sea level reconstructions, you can do all of them that you want. But at the end of the day, you're still producing models. And with that level of time sort of blurring the lines, it's pretty difficult to establish for sure whether this was an island or not. But the literature has demonstrated that it could be an island. It's at least possible that it was an island. And the fauna there are pretty weird. There's like 3 or 4 proposed dwarf dinosaurs. Zalmoxes, which is a euornithopod, Talmatosaurus, which is an ornithopod, Magyarosaurus, which is a long-necked dinosaur, a titanosaur. And those are really small. Something. Can you think of anything else? That might get fuzzy with telling whether these are actual dwarf dinosaurs.
Do we have any other ancestors?
Exactly.
That's one of them. So we've put them in. We've done phylogenies for them. I say we. Researchers who focus on this assemblage have done phylogenies on them, and they're coming back as pretty basal, which is interesting. So were they actually descended from larger bodied mainland relatives, or was the ancestral condition small? Hard to tell. Most
with sauropods, at least. Right.
So it seems reasonable that's a nanoid sauropod, a nanoid long-necked dinosaur. But another thing that gets thrown in here with elephants, if you have a dwarf elephant that you find, we have modern elephants. We can study their bones. We can study when they fuse and what adults and juveniles' bodies look like with relation to one another. So we can identify a juvenile elephant in the fossil record. That's a lot harder with dinosaurs. So accounting for ontogeny is another really big part of this process. Accounting for the fact that a juvenile dinosaur does not have the same body shape always as an adult dinosaur. So like if you think of a puppy, I don't know how much you've talked about ontogeny on this show, but if you have a puppy, it's got that kind of shorter snout and big paws that are kind of too big for its body, and it's kind of a little bit clumsy. Dinosaurs would have been like that too. The sort of body shape changed over the course of the lifespan. So another thing that these researchers had to do is they had to do histological studies. They had to cut into the bone sections of these dinosaurs and look at the growth marks in the bones to determine that they were actually looking at adults, because otherwise all these supposedly nanoid dinosaurs could have been just juveniles. And as it turns out, at least most of them, all of them that have been tested for ontogeny were at full maturity. But they still retain some slightly juvenile morphologies in some ways. So those are that may be kind of a different quirk, a paedomorphosis type thing, where kind of you reach sexual maturity and you're fully grown, but it's like dogs. Dogs look like young wolves. So an adult dog has
a really good example. My favorite example to go to for paedomorphosis or neoteny, as it's also sometimes called, is axolotls.
Right.
So most salamanders, when they're adults, do not have external gills, but through this mode of evolution, axolotls retain their gills from being juveniles and just keep them as adults.
Right. So what's that? This is a series of questions we didn't have to ask for the nanoid elephants.
Right.
So wait, was this an island at all? Are these nanoid dinosaurs actually just juveniles? In this case, it doesn't seem like it, but and then also, like, what is the ancestral condition? It's a lot harder to tell with stuff that we can't come up with DNA for or don't have a really good fossil record of on the mainland.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then also, really quickly, I can't mention Hatzeg Island without throwing in Hatzegopteryx, which is a proposed, and in my opinion, not super... I don't know how much I buy that it's giant because this was an island, but a giant pterosaur, roughly when it was walking around on the ground about as tall as a giraffe, with 30-ish foot wingspan or so. But it's been proposed that this was the apex predator on the island, eating all of these, miniaturized dinosaurs. Given that it could probably fly off the island, I don't know, and that we have other pterosaurs roughly the same size not on islands.
Right.
Makes me think,
yeah, that's another interesting one. Because if it can fly, that does kind of factor in with the separation of how far was this island away from the mainland. Because we've, with Quetzalcoatlus, there are proposed ways for how that animal would have taken off to fly. And so is this a case of this animal actually being isolated, or is it just that this animal or this taxa knew of this island's existence and was like, hey, small food that isn't super aware of predators?
Right.
To my knowledge, the royal we, have not found Hatzegopteryx anywhere else.
I don't believe so.
But is that a case of geology just being very spotty in that area for the right deposits, or was it only in that one place? We don't know unless we find some more of it.
Yeah, and that's another thing that you don't have to really worry about with things like all those dwarf proboscideans or anything around that we have today, where it's like, no, we can just put a GPS tracker on, anything on an island and see, do you happen to go to the mainland ever?
Right.
Much harder to do with fossils. So I guess since we've talked a good bit about some of the modes and things for dwarfism, let's talk a little bit about gigantism now, which is interesting because inherently, like we talked a little bit about it with that rabbit, but if food is scarce, why would you get bigger? Any takers on that one?
You dropped out there and I completely missed what you asked.
Oh, my bad. Sorry, the internet in this apartment is not awesome. What was the last thing you heard?
You were about to ask a question.
Right before you asked a question.
Okay. So, if food is scarce on islands, why would you ever get big?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to that island or that starvation resistance thing I was talking about earlier, where if you're a bigger animal, you have the ability to store more fat and be able to essentially use those fat stores during times when food is not plentiful or water is not plentiful. You think about how often a mouse has to eat or a hummingbird to maintain that high metabolic energy level versus something that is larger. Like elephants can go for a long time without finding water in some cases. And so if you have a larger body plan, you can store more nutrients and survive times when there's less available resources. And so that's one benefit of it. Mm-hmm. And if you look at a lot of the animals that do tend to undergo island gigantism, a lot of them are things like rodents and small scurrying animals that get bigger. And like rabbits, for example, they have a very high metabolism. And so if they don't need to have that high metabolism to be able to escape predators, mm-hmm. they can essentially direct that, or I'm acting as if evolution has like a mind of its own.
Yeah.
But the metabolic energy that is put into escaping predators can be put into a more useful thing for an island, which would be developing a way to survive those periods of starvation when there's no food or water on the island.
So I think broadly, this is another big oversimplification, but if you're on an island and food is sporadically scarce, there are periods of scarcity, then that bigger body size might help with that starvation resistance. If you're on an island and there's plenty of food year round, then I think island nanism is probably more likely to occur, where if there's limited food and it's always available, having a smaller body allows your population to be bigger.
Gotcha.
So I think there's kind of a play between how those periods of scarcity, I think, are probably a defining factor in there.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's some kind of interaction between those two. Yeah, I'm sure it is very, depending on a lot on each species' metabolic needs and things like that. But I'm sure that those two factors are really like at odds, and probably some of the most determinant factors in like how big and or small an animal can get. Because in theory, what would be, that selection pressure could just turn into a runaway, whereas we'd get elephants the size of rabbits, because to its logical conclusion, if you need less food and there's no predators on your island, why would you not continue to be small? So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard somebody earlier say something about plants doing this too.
Yeah,
well, we've tried this just as a general rule to stay as far away from plants on this podcast as possible, because I've said it many times before on this show. Plants scare me, and I don't like them.
You don't like plants? They're kind of necessary for life, Gavin.
I know that, but they'll just randomly double their genome and hybridize with things like in separate families. I don't understand how they work. And
this is just what you say about camels. You're like, I don't understand them. I don't like them.
And with plants, it's even more, because we did an episode just about plants in general, and I think I prefaced that episode with, it's going to sound like I'm uncomfortable this entire episode, and that's because I am. I don't know almost anything. I know that the chloroplast is the powerhouse of life on Earth, just like the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. But that's the extent of my plant knowledge. Not actually, but it is nice to hear that plants might actually be doing something that animals also do.
Yeah, so plants, in regards to the island rule, I'm just going to talk very generally. I am also not a botanist. My thesis was on horses, so this is kind of just mammals. Mammals.
What camels aspire to be.
Okay.
Shots fired. But anyways, with plants, there has been some evidence that plants change when they get isolated on an island, but not only in regards to size. So plants are very complicated organisms, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, but even so far back as Darwin's voyages, when he was trying to investigate things, he noticed that plants on islands had a more woody stem compared to their relatives on mainland. And you can actually see this today in the Canary Islands and in Hawaiian plants. And plants do sometimes exhibit size changes, but it's more to individual parts of them. For example, you could see leaf size increase or height. Sorry.
No, I can.
And it's thought to be due to interest-specific competition or to survive better at sea in some cases. For example, island plants, one somewhat consistent change in them is that they have a larger seed size compared to their mainland relatives, which if you think about it, higher or a larger seed allows for it to survive better in salt water for extended periods of time. So if the seed does fall into the ocean, it can make the journey to another island or come back to the island that it was originally from. Unfortunately,
and for example, I think, if I'm not wrong, some of the biggest seeds are incredibly famous for this, and that would be coconuts.
Right.
I believe so, yes.
So that's literally the entire job of a coconut.
Yeah, and so sometimes we'll also see plants having certain parts of them become gigantic and other parts within the same plant, mind you, decrease in size. So it's not a consistent thing with plants. And also, it's also due to competition. And in the fossil record, this is very problematic because plants, firstly, they don't fossilize very well. They're not full of hard bones or things that fossilize more easily. And then also, finding individual parts of a plant that link to each other is difficult. So you might have a fossilized seed here, a fossilized flower here, and a leaf and a stem. And linking all of those to one organism is pretty difficult for paleontologists and paleobotanists. And so one modern example of island gigantism on an island with plants is a plant, I'm going to probably butcher the pronunciation, apologies to all the botany people out there, Eronium urbicium. It's a 2-meter tall succulent that is in the Canary Islands, and it looks like a miniature tree. But if you think to your typical succulent that you'd see in someone's house, they are not 2 meters tall.
That was a much larger number of meters than I thought you were going to say.
Yeah, they are. If you ever want to look up some really interesting plants, this thing is. It looks like a tree mixed with a flower mixed with a succulent. They're cool. So that's a very brief overview of how plants can change. That doesn't mean they always do, but they can change.
Okay. Well, it's nice to hear something. I was going to say humanizing, but I guess animalizing about plants. So I guess as we're starting to wrap up here, I know, Rudy, earlier you mentioned some dubious examples of gigantism and or dwarfism. So what are some people lying about here?
It's not, it's so frequently, one of my biggest frustrations when I was doing the research for this paper was that a lot of the time people would say that something was a nanoid or an island giant or something without actually citing evidence that was the case. So they would see like, oh, small animal on island, big animal on mainland, must be a nanoid, must be an island nanoid.
Yeah, I ran into this too a lot.
Yeah. And a perfect example of that is Caribbean ground sloths, which I like alluded to before. But so in the Caribbean, we have on several different islands, I have this written down somewhere. Let's see, Hispaniola, Cuba, a series of other islands as well. There are different dwarf ground sloths. So ground sloths from South America were, in some cases, several meters tall. They could get quite big. And your biggest Caribbean one is maybe 1.5 meters long. That's Megalochnus. So a lot of them were actually smaller than that. And Megalochnus is from Cuba. So we've got smaller ground sloths in the Caribbean. But even though several like review papers and things like that have kind of attributed this to island nanism, there's, as far as I could find, no statistics or testing that have actually looked at like, are these actual island nanoids? Is the reason that they're small the fact that they're on islands? And it's part of the problem with this particular example is that sloth phylogeny is kind of weird. So the morphological phylogenies are evolutionary trees, and when you have a morphological phylogeny, that's one that's based on body traits that you observe, that you measure in the skeleton, and those phylogenies typically recover these Caribbean sloths in very different place on the tree than the the like genomic phylogenies, which are based on DNA. So there's a big discrepancy between what these sloths look like they would be in evolutionarily and what the DNA seems to be saying about them. And as a result, these guys are either basal to almost all other sloth groups, including the ones in South America. And in that case, that might, maybe the ancestral ground sloth state was small and these guys aren't island nanoids at all. But then other phylogenies recover them as fairly derived. So toward the, nested well within the phylogeny and being definitely having ancestral conditions that were very large bodied. So these guys, there's not really that much more to say about them. It's never really been looked at. There's not a whole lot of literature out on them at all. Most of it is descriptions and kind of first and last occurrence timelines. And that's all, useful and very valuable information. But to my knowledge, nobody has actually tested for the island rule. So there's this thing that happens where the island rule, because people, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think, because
that's a really good way to describe it.
Can happen when we see a small or a large, smaller than the mainland or larger than the mainland animal on an island. Our brain, our kind of brain tries to connect the dots and go, oh, it must be the island rule. And frequently the work doesn't get put into actually demonstrating that it is and making sure that that's the case before applying the term.
Essentially, paleontologists are letting their own ingrained biases based on what mainland relatives exist of this animal influence what they think their island relatives are.
And in fairness, they're not doing that intentionally. It's, most of these people know that they haven't tested for this stuff, but it's expedient to call it a nanoid even before knowing that it is.
Right. But also, really quick, do you hear that, kids? That sounds like a master's thesis topic.
I actually did play around with that as a follow-up idea, but someone should look at that. Yes.
Yes, please look into this, because the literature at the moment, there have been a few studies actually on tallying up the number of studies that are done on island dwarfism and gigantism and whether or not they agree that it's a thing or not. And it's roughly split at about 50-50, with 50% of papers saying that this is a thing and that the island rule is valid, and 50% saying that they aren't. However, that study didn't really take into, and essentially the conclusion of that study was, since it's 50-50, it's humans noticing patterns where there aren't actually patterns. However, that study didn't take into account several factors, like some of those papers were investigating a vast number of island dwarfism and gigantism probable cases, versus others were literally disproving one.
And I think what's going on here is that we've kind of shot ourselves in the foot by calling this the island rule, by implying that it always happens.
Right.
Because it clearly can happen, but it's the statistics are, like Carolyn was saying, there's a lot of studies on both sides of the fence saying whether or not it always happens.
And a good example of that, and I should know this better because I heard about it somewhat recently, but I don't remember the exact species it is off the top of my head. But there are 3 populations of the same species of snake on some islands off the coast of Australia that, depending on what island they're on, are the same size as the mainland, the same or smaller or bigger. So it's like it's the same. It starts from the same base size. So clearly, there's not a hard, fast rule.
Yeah,
it gets bigger or it gets smaller.
Yeah, it really is very case dependent. And one last example on the gigantism end of the spectrum is a critter from Madagascar called the giant fossa, which, if you guys have ever watched the movie Madagascar and you remember the King Julian and the lemurs going, fossa, that's these guys. And so they were actually a pretty large, they were, when they were around, the largest carnivores on the entire island, and probably preyed on the lemurs that grew to be about 150 kilograms.
Oh, so you had giant lemurs too, giant fossa preying on giant lemurs.
Like gorilla-sized lemurs.
Yeah, similar case to what I was talking about earlier with the Haas eagle, and these giant fossa essentially kind of filled a role similar to leopards, where they were an animal that took down prey larger than themselves. And the reason why the giant fossa is kind of a more tentative example of island gigantism is, we have no close living relatives or fossil relatives on the mainland of Africa. In fact, their closest relatives are actually mongoose, which also are on Madagascar. And their closest relative, like their phylogeny is kind of screwed up also. Like they're related to civets and hyenas distantly. So trying to find a relative on the mainland that's morphologically similar enough to compare them to is not happening. And then also you could argue that the giant fossa is actually not giant, it's just undergoing island dwarfism, because the modern day fossa is smaller than the giant fossa, so one could argue that it was just getting smaller.
Right. It wasn't giant back then, it's nanoid now.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, that's a really fun example. I like that.
And you could also I think a case could be made that it's not island nanism, because it was like, if it was getting bigger at the time, it may have been getting bigger as a result of its prey getting bigger, which would actually not have as much to do with the island itself. If the island doesn't play into the cause closely, then is it really the island?
Yeah, that's kind of going back to our earlier talk about how isolation and the size of the island really factors in on how pronounced you can see these changes due to Foster's rule. Madagascar is a pretty big island.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. This was a really good conversation. But I did tease earlier talking about extinctions on islands and things. And that's to say, just really quick, humans are real good at getting rid of stuff on islands.
Yes.
Particularly the ones where there weren't any predators before. I think a really great example of that is a dodo. The dodo is, I think, if I'm not mistaken about where dodos kind of are in relation to other birds, is that they are closest related to pigeons and their cousins.
That's correct.
That's what I had heard, yes.
And so it was basically like a pigeon more or less the size of a turkey, maybe a little smaller. And of course, flightless. And there were no predators on that island.
Giant.
Until, humans got there. And they made quick work of them. And there are many examples, particularly with flightless birds, but also a handful of like giant rodents are also being threatened by things like, not even like overhunting, like you typically think of with things like the dodo, but even just like us bringing all of the things we bring with us, whether it's our cats or our dogs or our rats that hang out on our ships and stuff.
Rats are a big problem.
And all of that. Oh, go ahead.
One example of that is in Hawaii, rats got onto the islands and started decimating the local bird populations because they would eat the eggs. Because as we've talked about a few times already, when you are on an island and there's less predators, certain adaptations like flight and also like nesting in trees aren't really necessary to avoid predators. And so a lot of birds in Hawaii are ground nesting birds. And so the rats were eating the eggs and whatnot, and also invasive snakes, other invasive animals. And so settlers actually brought mongoose to the Hawaiian Islands to try to deal with that problem. However, they didn't account for the fact that the mongoose are, I believe they essentially, the animals were not active at the same time in order to interact and be preyed upon. The mongooses actually made the problem worse and also ate the bird eggs.
Wow.
Classic cane toad problem.
Yeah. And just like two of the examples I talked about are also examples where humans probably played a major factor in their extinction. The Haas eagle that I was talking about and the giant fossa.
Yeah. And it's, one thing. So, for example, for invasive species, of something native to, let's say, Asia being introduced in Eastern North America, that is a problem. Invasive species are a pretty big problem everywhere. But generally, when you're talking continent scale, there's more land for you to move to. On an island, that's not the case.
Yeah, island ecosystems tend to be kind of, I guess, frail, maybe.
Yes.
And even from things like disease as well, because inherently you have a smaller gene pool on an island if you're relying on things to be drifted there. And so populations on islands are just generally genetically less, resistant to things like disease, things, depending on the ecology and how their evolutionary path happened to go, potentially things like drought or even too much rain. Island ecosystems are magical.
That's one way of putting it.
All right. Thank you both for coming on. It was fun sort of catching up and learning about islands and all the magical laboratories of evolution that they are.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. It's kind of neat to be on this podcast that I've been listening to on and off. Really, really liked the decolonizing paleo episode that you guys did. If you listeners have not checked that one out, please do. It's awesome.
Episode 33 or 34, if I remember correctly.
How do you remember all of that information?
I try to remember the ones that are frequently referenced back to. But it's actually kind of topical that you mentioned that episode because I believe soon-to-be Dr. Nasaiba Raja is from Mauritius, the island that the dodos were from.
That's true.
Oh, cool.
Yep. So,
and I believe you also did a podcast, Gavin, with Darren, who's the guy we keep referencing for this class, and also Gavin's hatred of camels.
Yeah, that is correct. Well, no, he's not the reason I hate camels. He's the reason why I now slightly tolerate them.
You know what I mean. But if you want to hear Gavin talk about his dislike of camels, that's probably the thing to listen to.
And that's not an episode that I know off the top of my head.
Yes, I stumped him.
All right. Well, this was a lot of fun. Thank you all for listening and indulging us for catching up a little bit at the beginning. Ideally, Fia will be back with us next week, and Mike will be back with us when he is done adventuring. And once again, thank you both for being here and nerding out with me for an hour, and we will see you all next week.
Our pleasure.
This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Finella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.